We are on now. Hello, my name's Garland Nixon, and I'm here with Professor Nicolai Petro, and we're going to talk about some very interesting issues regarding Ukraine, regarding BRICS, regarding multipolarity, etc. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and just so if anybody's wondering, I guess, have to upload this to Rumble lately because I just got a notification. If for some reason it's not on Rumble, but that's okay. Anybody who's looking for it on Rumble, it will be up later when I get a chance. All right, so we're going to talk about the issue of neutrality, security, and civilizational realism. We're going to talk about BRICS. We're going to talk about varying visions for how the world can operate efficiently and effectively, and we're here with Professor Nicolai Petro. Professor Petro, can you give a brief bio about what you're doing and your recent books?
Sure. First of all, nice to see you. For the last 2+ years, you've been a little more than a disembodied voice at the other end of a phone for me. So this is the first time we're actually seeing each other face to face. So the topic for today that I guess we'll be talking about the most.
And by the way, what university are you at, and what's your latest book?
Yeah. So I'm a professor of politics at the University of Rhode Island, and my last book, written and published in 2020, the end of 2022, early 23, was The Tragedy of Ukraine. And I gave a talk last month in Kyoto, Japan, about neutrality, security, and civilizational realism.
Now, let's talk about that because, one of the things that you discuss, and I think it's important to talk about, particularly in light of the discussions that will likely be coming up, I would argue, nothing's 100%, between the Trump administration and Russia, Ukrainian so-called leaders, whatever the case may be, the leaders in Kiev, whatever you want to call them. And that is about the issue of neutrality. Russia is strong. Russia is saying, look, Ukraine's got to be neutral. Understand that. They've been attacked through Ukraine before. Meanwhile, the West, the U.S. and Ukraine are arguing Ukraine should be able to ally with anyone that it wants to, even though there's on Russia's border. In theory, that makes sense when it comes to neutrality of sovereignty of a country. In practical application, based on its history of what one may argue in some instances a forced alliance with the U.S., you can understand where Russia would be apprehensive. So your thoughts on neutrality through the perspective of sovereignty and the right of a country to be neutral or not, if it wants, as opposed to the reality that you're stuck next to this giant world power that also has strategic interest of being attacked.
Right. So the issue, I think, is not whether countries have the right to choose their alliances. They inevitably do. But some choices are clearly better than others for the security interests of that state itself. So the argument that came up repeatedly at this international conference that I attended is how often neutrality is preferable to alliance, which pits you in one camp against another. If you don't want to be part of a conflict or some sort of division in the world, then a number of states have historically chosen to be neutral, in between these two large camps. The idea of neutrality or non-alignment comes out of the Cold War era, when a lot of countries, particularly in Asia and Africa, did not want to be forced to join one bloc or another. And the idea that they had was to carve out a space between the two blocs that could hopefully be a space for peace. And by more states joining in this neutral territory, they would not be forced into choosing one side against another. And that seems to be relevant also, some people argue, with respect to Ukraine. So certainly in Ukraine, in history, this was understood when when Ukraine declared its independence in 1990 and held a referendum and then subsequently became independent in 1991. As a matter of fact, neutrality was written into its constitution. And as leading Russian officials have said, they were perfectly willing to accept Ukraine's borders under those terms. In other words, it was under the terms that Ukraine would be neutral and therefore would never be an enemy aligned against Russia. But once the Ukrainian government chose to make itself an enemy of Russia, that shifted the security calculus for Russia. And that is what led to the current, among other things, the current violence.
Now, there's another factor that I'd like you to talk about, and it's critical. When you talk about Ukraine considering neutrality or non-neutrality or alignment with another country, all of those things, there's another context, and that is, there's one thing if Canada does it. Canada is fairly stable politically. Fairly. One could argue they got their issues, but fairly politically stable. There is what it seems to me is a long-running civil, cold, and sometimes hot war going on in Ukraine. So the issue of Ukraine's neutrality, the issue of how Ukraine interacts with Russia versus the U.S., I think that's also affected, and there's concerns of the internal stability of Ukraine. You know what I mean? There are warring factions in Ukraine. A guy who I know very well who is Ukrainian and has family in Ukraine, and he swears, he says, Garland, I'm going to tell you, when this thing ends, there will be a civil war in Ukraine. And he says, I can't even talk to my own mother. She's aligned with the Banderites. And, he talks about that. My own mother won't speak to me because she's a Banderite and I'm opposed to that. So to me, that shows that's the, war of brothers and, in the U.S. Civil War. Your thoughts of the internal contradictions, the internal problems, and how that affects this issue of a stable country being able to be neutral versus an unstable country.
Well, the reason that countries become unstable, I don't want to say this is the only reason, but it is often because the two opposing blocs are trying to promote one group in the country over another, so that the entire country comes over to one bloc or the other. And in the case of Ukraine, the problem is that both parties, those who want to be in NATO and those who would rather not be in NATO and prefer neutrality, not to mention the people who would prefer to be aligned with Russia. But I think that currently that number is small. But the number who see increasing problems with Russia for Ukraine because of the choice to ally with NATO, entirely with NATO, is a large number, probably at least a third of the country. And as a result, that the inability to allow for a civil discourse about this choice, and to the decision of the Ukrainian government in 2019 by the previous president to change the constitution in such a way to mandate forever the objective of joining NATO and the EU in Ukrainian politics is, of course, an effort to prevent a public discussion and a democratic discussion of this contentious issue. And that's what's creating, in many respects, this kind of conflict, which will no doubt, and I agree with your friend, because a lot of political analysts in Ukraine have said the same thing, it is going to continue even if there were a ceasefire tomorrow.
Right. One of the things that he said was there are a lot of people that are angry at the Banderites who are going to say, look what you did to us, look what you did to our country, look what you put us through, and we got nothing out of it. And of course, the Banderites will be furious because they'll say, you made a deal with the evil Russians. The Russians are so evil. You can never make a deal with the devil because they are demonic and them blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? Their position, anti-Russian position, is so hardcore, there could never be a deal with them. Right. And so those two ways of viewing the world, there's no way to resolve them without a fisticuffs, shall we say.
Well, I thought about this a little, and I think there may be a resolution. I'm going to suggest that it should have been enacted to the benefit of Ukrainian politics many years ago, and it is to ensure the supremacy of government authority over domestic radicals. In other words, you cannot have a functioning democracy and a functioning legal order if you have militarized groups acting independently of state authority. And that I'm talking about far right militarized groups, paramilitary units, which have existed well before 2014. They can be traced, their origins in Ukrainian politics, to the early 2000s, and they already demonstrated their influence in Ukrainian society beginning in 2004. And after 2014, members of those groups began to assume even greater responsibility in government positions. And today, I would say their authority stems from their dedication to victory or death. Now, the problem with fighting to victory at the possibility of death is you're not just talking about your own death, but in the case of a power that is clearly so overwhelming compared to your own, you may indeed be courting the death of your nation. And the problem with having the far right pursue this agenda is they seem at this point, some of them, many of them, to be happy with dying in a blaze of glory, not only themselves, but their entire country, so that out of the ashes of some sort of completely destroyed Ukraine, they could forge a proper, pure, disciplined Ukrainian nation only for Ukrainians, which of course has nothing to do with the EU model of government or what we understand as democracy in the West.
You know, what's interesting about that concept, these various extremist groups, one of the issues that Russia has brought forth, as talked about, is the issue of Western interference, Western domination over Ukrainian politics, right?
Yeah.
And if we look historically at these extremist groups, it seems to me, it is my evaluation that their power and strength doesn't come from Ukraine, that it comes from the West. They're from various entities in the West who empowered them. As an example, before 2014, before Maidan, they were not official parts of the government or of the military. After 2014, they were inculcated into the military as official state parts of the a state apparatus, and they were empowered. And again, in talking to my Ukrainian friends, etc., they say, well, this is what they'll say: they get their strength from Canada and Foggy Bottom, right? That's where their power is, and that's why they become more and more power. And that one of the things they put was, the existence and strength of these groups is kind of synonymous with Western interference. That there are people in Ukraine that see them as the most shining example of Western interference, that without the Western interference, they don't have the authority and power. And that basically, I was told, some people in Ukraine look at them, point to them and say, that right there is Western interference. If the Western interference goes, they are disempowered, and vice versa. And I think that's probably the Russians to some extent. That when they speak of denazification, I think that's part of the concept that they're viewing. Anyway, your thoughts on all of that, Dr. Petro?
You're right. There are some people who see them as the tip of the spear in Ukrainian politics, trying to remove Russian influence, but also promote Western interests. I would say, however, that this is a misreading of the objectives of far-right nationalism in Ukraine. Far-right nationalists are as anti-Western as they are anti-Russian. And the reason for that is that they despise all of the democratic and liberal values that the West is currently touting. They are, in other words, today in Ukraine, in a marriage of convenience with the West. They're willing to provide the bodies to fight on the front lines, but they expect assistance from the West in return. But over the long run, the kind of society that they want is perhaps most closely akin to what Benito Mussolini wanted in fascist Italy. In other words, a society that was entirely cohesive, entirely unified, and led by a single party. And if you read the documents of any of these movements from the 1930s to the present in Ukraine, they are consistent in that argument that they want, first and foremost, a unified, politically, culturally, linguistically, and religiously pure Ukraine. That only that kind of national unity will provide Ukraine with the power that it needs, with the strength that it needs to fight against the Russians and distinguish themselves culturally from Russia, but also to preserve itself against the dissolution of Western liberal values.
Now, let me throw this at you. I agree with you, but there is a thinly veiled dance going on here where both sides are doing the same thing, wherein I could put it this way: they're using the West to achieve their value, that what we want. Ultimately, you're going to give us the money and the weapons and all these other things, and we're going to, some kind of way or other, defeat the Russians, however you want to put it, right? Meanwhile, the neocons, we'll call them that, are okay. We'll use these guys to knock out the Russians. Everybody's going to use everybody else to knock out the Russians, and in
we're
the
so
end,
much smarter.
yes, and in the end, we'll settle up. And by settle up, it means I'll double cross the other side. You know, in reality, the whole game is you're going to help me achieve your goal, my goal, unknowingly, that I'm going to double cross you at the end, and vice versa. And everybody's planning on using the other person and double crossing the other person at the end. And there's no honor amongst thieves, as they say in Zen. What is it? When two thieves see each other on the road, they need no introduction.
Yeah. Right. So it's politics if you're not a fool. It's the nature of politics. But the I wouldn't say the problem, but the issue is that the the people in charge really do believe that they're smarter and able to outwit their opponents. And that, of course, never works out exactly as you plan. And sometimes exactly the reverse happens. And then the game starts all over. So the thing that allows these ideas to persist is political passion or a passion for an ideology. Now, it may seem strange for Americans who are taught to be pragmatic to fight for an ideal, and to sort of commit their lives and all future generations of their nation also to this ideal. But what makes it more plausible in the case of Ukraine is the concept of nationalism. So nationalism is that ideological bridge that allows you to be convinced that you will succeed no matter what happens. Even if you die, you and your ideals and your dreams will arise out of the ashes for future generations, and you will be honored for your sacrifice. You will be honored someday. And in fact, there's evidence of this in Ukrainian society, at least in Western Ukraine, where indeed the generation that of Ukrainians allied with Nazi Germany during World War II is today being resurrected and redefined as heroes of Ukraine. It took several generations, and it is not universal in Ukraine. It is very largely in the western regions of Ukraine, and those, as you put them, Banderites, followers of Stepan Bandera, are still reviled as traitors in most of eastern and southern Ukraine. But the fight goes on for these ideals.
And I do want to get into the potential or into the discussions of and the potential for peace negotiations. But I think something else that is part of this overarching discussion, and I think it's fraudulent in a lot of ways, and that is this assertion that what's going on in the Ukraine conflict is not just about independence, sovereignty, and boundaries. That there is, as you have put it, competing visions. That the West, that the U.S. and its allies, colonies, vassals, any terms you want to use, negative or positive, the U.S. and its alliance are standing for some kind of liberal values of democracy, et cetera, and a worldview that's the best for everybody and best for the world. Okay. And they're up against Russia and the evil other alliance, which I often refer to as a Eurasian-centered alliance, right?
Right.
The BRICS alliance. There's a lot of ways to put it. And that there are two very different, there are what now seems to be competing world visions. One of what we'll call a kind of mosaic, where there are a bunch of the BRICS. We've got a bunch of different civilizations, we've got a bunch of different cultures, and everybody can have their own civilization and culture, and we'll all come together and work and survive, as opposed to a competing vision, which seems to be the Western vision, that there is but one Tino. There's no alternative, right? And that this one should be imposed, even if it's militarily imposed on the world. Your thoughts about how Ukraine fits into that vision and the realities of that vision, your thoughts on that vision, those competing visions.
Right. So the West has long advocated, under various terminology, the idea of a liberal internationalism, which precisely because it mandates the specific values of the West as the ideal for all nations, is not ultimately it's not ultimately up to nations themselves to decide. They are expected to decide for liberal internationalism because it is in the interests of their own people to do so. And that's why acting to constrain the choices of other nations not to be liberal and not to be democratic as defined by the West is indeed a core part of America's and now Western Europe's mission in the world. I should probably say NATO's mission in the world. There is, however, disagreement with that in many countries. The largest contingent numerically of those countries used to be called the Third World, and now is probably more often referred to as the Global South. But those countries say, well, wouldn't it make more sense and be better for the world to allow nations to choose their own path rather than one path of development mandated by the West? And so that is indeed the dividing line. Now, the West doesn't like to brook arguments about its choice of civilizational values. It simply stipulates that its values are the best. And if by stipulating that view, they are essentially mandating and expecting a path of development that leads the entire world toward its own vision, a unipolar vision, one in which the West leads the rest of the world. The alternative vision, which is, as I argue, and is espoused by the BRICS nation in Brazil, Russia, India, China, and nearly half a dozen other nations now, which are part of this agglomeration of states, is that actually diversity is better for the world. And we shouldn't, in fact, be mandating values. We should simply be learning to get along with each other. So the shorthand for that view is multipolarity. And so there's an argument that the West makes unipolarities better for the world, because so long as we define the values that the world is moving toward. And the other view is that no, multipolarity is actually better for the world, for all of humanity, and because it leads to fewer conflicts down the road and to a greater diversity of development, again, which is a better model for the world overall.
So let me throw a monkey wrench, a spanner in the works of this discussion, which I think has to happen. You have the intellectual discussions like this, but sooner or later, you've got to throw something like this in here.
Sure.
Let me give an example. I came from law enforcement and I saw all kinds of scams and different things and all kinds of weird cases. And one of the cases I remember was this guy who ran this organization, and his organization was when young people become 18 and they're in the system, as they say, they're in not adoption. What do you call them when they stay in temporary foster care and all this?
Yeah, temporary foster care.
Then they turn 18, and basically the state says, you're on your own. Here's a couple dollars and go out into the world and make your own. And they don't have any way to do anything, right? So this guy had this organization to help those young people, particularly young girls. You see where I'm going?
Yeah.
Well, ultimately, it eventually came out from a number of the young girls that his plan was much more devious and diabolical than it appeared. That while it may appear to the naked eye that he was trying to do good, he really clandestinely had nefarious so he could take advantage of young 18-year-old girls at will, which he did, had
Mhm.
got several of them pregnant. You can figure out where this story went, right? Okay.
Right.
Here's my point on that. Well, when the US says, look, we think it would be far better if countries are individual, we'll take on our way, liberal values, blah, 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 blah. And what we mean by that is that they will allow us to install a puppet government and get all their oil at the cheapest possible price. And none of the value of their resources goes back to the help of the people, to help the people. Oh, by the way, and we'll install a brutal, vicious, far right-wing dictator if need be, so that we can make sure that we get all of that stuff. So that's it. That beneath at least one of the arguments, we can discuss whether the BRICS argument is that or not. I haven't heard it alleged, but I'm sure someone might allege that there's nefarious intent behind the BRICS argument. But history tells us, from the Opium Wars, when it was done in the open, to the United Fruit Company, on, history tells us that this business of going into Africa or Asia or Latin America and helping out the people with lithium so that they'll have a liberal values, generally that's a euphemism for pirateering or imperialism, whatever. Okay, I'm throwing that at you, Dr.
So
Petro.
I catch your drift. The issue is as simple as Lord Acton put it: power corrupts. Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So the more dominant any nation is in the world, the more likely it is to exert that power in ways that it justifies as beneficial, but that others at the receiving end of this power probably will not agree with. And you don't need for the actors of a great nation exerting great influence in the world to be bad or to be motivated by evil intent. In fact, another popular saying is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think a lot of advocates of the use of American influence and power to condition the behavior of states where we can influence and to contain states that we have defined as our enemies. Their argument is that this is actually coincidentally in our interests, but it's actually in the interests of all nations. And they are simply not going to listen to arguments that say that it is primarily this policy is primarily undertaken because it is in America's interests. That policy, that idea that it is primarily in the policy of in the interest of the United States to be the dominant power in the world, in fact, appeals to realists. But the nice thing about framing it, a liberal international order, in the way that it is currently framed, is that you can use the power aspect of it that benefits the United States to get the realists in political office and in influential think tanks and in newspapers to be on your side, and the liberals at the same time who are arguing, well, I don't want to see the hostility that this engenders. Over the long run, I'm just confident that people will thank us. Remember Richard Pearl arguing when the invasion of Iraq occurred that he would be astonished if the Iraqi people themselves don't put up a statue to George W. Bush in 5 years or so. And I think he was just surprised that the Iraqis didn't see their invasion the same way that his colleagues in Washington saw it.
So let's let's get to something that I think is critical for this discussion, and that is the this discussion of, I think to some extent what we're talking about is, world domination, kind of an empire, the U.S. and its allies dominating the world, and how that is now being mitigated by BRICS and who wants to be in and who doesn't. Okay. All that now is the rubber's going to meet the road here in another couple months, I believe. And that is the Trump administration. Trump at least has indicated, I want a deal to end Ukraine, to get out of this thing. I'll be out in 24 hours. Well, you think you can end this in 24 hours? You don't understand the complexity of things. But in fact, to end the war is going to begin something else. I'm sure something else is going to start there that might not be pretty. But at any rate, but I don't see, based on the discussions I've had of people who are, U.S. hegemonists, right? The U.S. has to dominate, which means when the U.S. gets a deal, it has to walk away from this deal and say, we won. Right. It has to walk away and say, we fought. And when we walked away, Russia acquiesced to certain things. That ain't happening. There's no possibility. Russia is looking at their borders saying, this is our strategic, it's within our sphere of strategic influence. And I think that Russia feels that they're fighting for their life on their border, and they will fight for their life on their border. And if they don't get the deal that they want, they will keep fighting. And the only answer is, you're going to have to come in and fight us. If you know what I mean, that Russia's answer is going to be, no, we're winning this war. If you give us the deal we want, that we're going to get eventually when we win, we'll take it now. Otherwise, we're going to keep fighting. And if you say stop, the answer is no. And if you want us to stop, there ain't but one way for that to happen. That's up to you. And that's kind of the way I see it, based on my interactions with Russians and their view of this through the context of history, through the context of World War II, through the context of existential threats to the Russian Federation. And they see that as this. And I think they're fighting what they view as an existential threat to the Russian Federation. Your thoughts?
Yes, I think you're right about the Russian view. But we now are entering a different phase of Western policy with respect to Russia and Ukraine. We shall see how it develops, because we are no longer talking about a West that is rhetorically united in favor of defeating, forcing a strategic defeat on Russia. I think the Washington Post had an article very recently, which they concluded with a Western diplomat. They interviewed 10 Western diplomats on this. And they said, well, the one thing we can't have is anything that is viewed as a Russian victory. It's too late for that. The writing is on the wall. Now, and besides which, when has that ever been the problem for the West? It's never been a problem. From the days of Vietnam, there was a famous phrase bandied about Americans declaring victory and going home. That's exactly what is to be expected here. We will reach an agreement, certainly, which the Trump administration will define as a victory of sorts. What happens 2 years down the road is anybody's guess. But remember, we have a unique circumstance now. Trump is only in office for 4 years. He has nothing to run for again. And his rather, let's say, unusual choices of cabinet members currently, as from what we can see, suggests to me a policy that we may be seeing a cabinet of slash and burn. In other words, send in someone into the Defense Department who will root out the people who are not willing to carry out Trump's policies, which we know happened in his first administration. Maybe the same thing that same type of purge will be conducted in the State Department and in other places. Of course, that scares the entrenched bureaucracy and the deep state. The Wall Street Journal had an article by Holman Jenkins that said, let's have a truce between the deep state and the Trump administration. I think that is probably unlikely for all the reasons that the ideological commitments of each side. Each side is arguing that they are saving America from the other side. So I think what we will see with Trump with respect to Ukraine is an increasing distancing from Europe. So Europe, the current European administration, is committed to continuing support for the Ukrainian war effort, even if the United States withdraws. And I think the United States will limit its assistance significantly and leave Europe holding the bag. But how long the current European leadership will remain in office, precisely because, in part, it is committed to continuing this war, particularly in Germany, but also France and Britain, is a big question. If this sort of political earthquake can occur in the United States, there's just as much reason to expect that it will occur in Europe as well. And we don't have long to wait in Germany.
Let me ask you this, something you know, I mean, I know your area of studies is Ukraine and Russia. The deal in Russia, you know, and they teach in the U.S., brainwashing schools. Vladimir Putin is the dictator of all dictators, and he says everything in Russia, and everybody just bows down to their knee and say, yes, sir. But in reality, that ain't the truth. He has people he has to answer to. He does have public sentiment and all that. So there is certainly an issue. For as much as he is, in fact, a beloved figure, the Russian people have a context of history, and they have a fear of, when they see German tanks come across their border, that brings back, I used to work with Russians, and they would say, both of my grandparents died. My grandfather and all, he had 7 brothers. They all died in World War. When you hear the story, every family you talk to lost numerous people. And so they have World War II is living history to the people in Russia. Okay. The pressures on Vladimir Putin internally regarding a deal are very real. Your thoughts about that?
Well, having lost so many lives in this struggle, which Putin has defined as an existential struggle for Russian sovereignty and Russia's ultimate sort of role in the world as an independent power, he can hardly sacrifice those principles and go back to the Russian people and expect to have their support. He at least as much as Trump, I'm not going to say more because this gets into issues of psychology. He is interested in leaving a legacy that will allow for a stable transition to whoever succeeds him. We don't know who that will be, just as we don't know in the United States. But it will need to be someone who is either who was part of the current Russian revival and would sort of run on a platform of continuing it. So being a more modern, but essentially continuation of Putin, a younger and more modern Putin. And that's, I think, pretty much the only possibility that I see currently in Russia. If Russia is defeated, of course, and acknowledges that defeat, then all the cards are thrown up in the air in terms of Russian stability. But that should be an outcome greatly to be feared by the West and by Europeans, because it would mean the possibility not only of someone liberal and pro-Western coming to power, an outcome that I think is highly unlikely, but of someone even more radical and anti-Western coming to power. I think Putin is actually in between those two extremes.
Oh, absolutely. I think he is a nationalist, but I think he is an intellectual, and I think he is very Russian to me. You know what I mean? He moves slow. I say about Russians, they look both ways before crossing a one-way street, right?
Well, there's another saying. I'll share this Russian saying with you. Measure 7 times, cut once.
Yes, yeah, I've heard about variances of those also. But now let me ask you this. Zelensky and his regime, to be quite frank, at this point, seem illegitimate in the eyes of certainly the Russian leadership, just to an extent. It seems to me that based on what's been going on internally, it will be different. I mean, if Zelensky ran tomorrow, Putin, I heard the joke that the Ukrainians were saying that Putin could get more votes than him. Vladimir Putin could get more votes than him
I
in
doubt
Ukraine.
that.
Certainly in jest, right?
Yeah.
But how do you take a country that's been torn to shreds by war, totally dominated, almost in the open by the US government? I mean, to some extent, I mean, at least they try to hide it, but they were sending, a forever march. Jake Sullivan's there one week. Tony Blinken's basically saying, now you can do this. Now you can't do this. You can step right. Now you can step left. Oh, wait a minute. We're sending Bojo in. And it just really, the appearance of being a cat's paw is glaring. How does a country like that, in the event that there is some kind of a resolution, create a government, and a government that's not another puppet government for Western imperialism, if you will forgive me for using a term that I frequently use?
Well, I mean, to me, the most glaring, shocking example of the current government's willingness to throw away its resources and its dignity is when Zelensky said, as part of his deal, his victory plan, that he would be willing to invite the West to use up Ukraine's natural resources, that these are all for auction, only to Western bidders. So they would get it at a good price, and they should exploit it to their advantage. And he's willing to support that. So the prospects for unity within Ukraine after the war will not rest with Zelensky. Zelensky is positioning himself as the wartime leader, not the post-war leader. That leaves a huge vacuum because it is not clear what sort of figure will be able to pick up the pieces of a country that, as you correctly say, has been torn asunder, and try to appeal to the broadest possible constituency. And that constituency, at least rhetorically for the current government, includes the millions of people that are currently in Russian-occupied territory and even Crimea. So if you're going to appeal to those people, you cannot appeal to them on the basis of more fighting and reconquest, because they are not. I would argue there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that they would rather live peaceful lives than be fought over endlessly, and that if that model of living as Ukrainians under Russian authority proves successful, then it undermines the argument of the current nationalist government in Kiev that the Russians are only out to exterminate all Ukrainians. If they don't exterminate Ukrainian identity in those occupied territories, and Putin has indicated that he has no interest in doing so, and has even spoken recently to the effect that Ukrainian should be taught in alongside Russian in primary schools in those territories where it has been taught for many years, and that's perfectly natural and understandable, then it undermines the long-term basis for, again, for extreme nationalism, for far-right nationalism in Ukraine. But that's sort of a prospect down the road. There is no political basis currently in the remainder of Ukraine that is not under Russian control for a consensus vision on how to deal with the future. And I don't see a political figure arising who could offer one. There are people who argue that the former commander-in-chief Zaluzhny, who was removed from office for his failure to successfully conduct the counteroffensive in 2023, and the current Ukrainian ambassador to Great Britain, would be such a candidate. He might indeed be a popular figure among veterans and among sort of people who are directly involved in the war. But the question is, what is he going to offer to the majority of people, more and more, who are tiring of the war and willing to seek compromises in order to end the bloodshed? Can he rise to that occasion? Can he be a military leader who thinks beyond the military and to a peacetime transition and to peacetime stability for Ukraine? So far, there is no evidence of that in Ukrainian society proper that would really lead to an expectation of a countervailing and popular political alternative to the current regime.
The other thing about the territories that Russia has taken or annexed. Okay. The Ukrainian argument, the Western / Ukrainian argument, that they want those back. We want to take those and all the people back. People that you have shelled, bombed, and dropped fragment bombs on. You've outlawed their language. You've outlawed their religion. So, and many of them identify as ethnic Russian, and you're saying it's illegal to speak ethnic Russian, to worship ethnic Russian. Basically, it's illegal to be ethnic Russian. And we already know how you're going to vote.
Yeah.
So the argument that the Ukrainian government wants to bring back millions of people who are literally outlawed as human beings and who would vote as a bloc, as they did before with Viktor Yanukovych, and likely put in someone that was more sympathetic to their interests. Subsequently, that would probably be more sympathetic to a Russian alliance. It's preposterous. So their argument that they want them back. I tell you what it really implies to me. If I'm there, this is what I think. They want the land back, but they want to kill us all. That's what it would imply to me. It would imply they want the territory back, but they want to either genocide the people in the territory or drive them out of that territory into Russia and take the territory. I mean, I'm an outsider. That looks that way to me.
No, but we know that in so many words, that was the policy of the Ukrainian government as promulgated by Alexei Reznikov, the person who prior to the current Minister of Defense was the head of the Ukrainian military, the head of the defense department there. And the plan that he supported in the parliament involved mass repatriation to Russia, back to Russia, as he puts it, of people who, as he puts it, came there during the period of Soviet colonial occupation. So these are all people, millions of people in the case of Crimea and elsewhere, who, if they are identified by the state as such, would lose everything and be forced to leave. And as he says himself, as in the parliamentary debates over that issue, we are talking about at least 500,000 people, if not more, in the case of Crimea alone. So that's never been hidden as the objective. Why pursue this? Well, because it is a nationalist dream. It is a nationalist dream to reintegrate these territories and, as you say, inhabit them with true Ukrainians. What to do with the people who are living there now has never been satisfactorily explained, and no feasible project for allowing the people who are there now to be part of Ukrainian society has ever been conceived of in Ukraine, except I would say at the outset of the 1990s, when the head of the popular Ruch movement, which was a movement with strong support in Western Ukraine, the head of it was a popular political figure at the time, Chernovil, Vyacheslav Chernovil, who died in a car accident, actually advocated for a federal system of government in Ukraine, which would allow regions to define their own ethnic identity. And he said he didn't even want Crimea in Ukraine itself, because he thought it should be associated or perhaps independent of the Ukrainian Federation, because it had so few true Ukrainians. The problem is currently, and for the last decade or more, the very idea of federalism has been considered taboo in Ukrainian society, although it is the logical political solution to countries that are so ethnically and politically divided, to allow for regional identity to be a marker that could be used in support of national unity rather than acting against it. But of course, what we would need then is a second camera, a second House of Representatives in Ukraine, because right now they have a single unicameral legislature, and all the political decisions in the country are made in Kiev. And that's not a problem that arose recently. That is a problem in the original formation of the state.
Lastly, because I know we've been an hour, but I do have another thought that I'd like to throw at you, and this is related to Ukraine, but not internally. The ruling elite in Europe have thrown their hat in 100% with the Biden, Nuland, let's take out Russia and use Ukraine as a tool to do it crew. Okay. And they've given their people, a definitive end. We're going to defeat Russia, and eventually, and when we do, we'll move forward from there. But that's an outcome, no other outcome. And might I add, if we don't, the Russians hordes will come west and won't stop until they get to the English Channel, as Russian hordes tend to do in the minds of the ruling elite in Europe for the last several hundred years. But only in the minds of the elites in Europe. Okay, here's my point. How do you get out of that one? You know what I mean? It's almost like every now and then there'll be some, there was this cult in Japan, and they said the world's going to end on such and such a day, and we're all going to go up to a mountain and we'll be taken away. And they went up to the mountain, and guess what? the day went away and they all kind of just went home, right? You tell people this is it. This is an apocalyptic pronouncement. This happens. And if there is a deal, which I think at some point it looks like there will be, something's going to happen, but this thing's over, and the Russians don't continue on heading to the, and the Russians say, what are you talking about? We just want a security agreement. And at some point you have to acknowledge, yeah, that was never true. And the people are saying, we've been deindustrialized. We've been cold. We've done all of this suffering, and we were told we have to suffer in order to be secure from the Russian hordes. And now we find out that we were always secure from the Russian hordes. What the hell did we suffer for? What happens in Europe when the rubber meets the road on these pronouncements of, end times pronouncements that were, shall we say, a bit premature by the ruling elite?
Well, the answer, so your question, I think, has two parts. How do we change this narrative, and to what happens as a result when it does change? So the answer to the former is that the narrative changes when attention is paid to the actual actions of the Russian Federation and the agreements that it has signed and honored, and what Russian leaders actually say when people are allowed to see their words directly. The difficulty in doing so is, of course, the global censorship that the West is attempting to impose on Russian sources. But that has a lot of holes in it. And I suspect that those holes will become larger and larger over time as people begin to understand that what they are being told in many areas, but also in this one, they already understand how often the media misinform them on a number of different issues, but they kind of still hope in their heart of hearts that on foreign policy, they're not being lied to as badly. When that realization comes to them, they will ditch so many Western sources and begin to look for the information on sources that are from Russia, China, and many other sources around the world. What will happen then is what we are already seeing happen in elections. So far, local elections in Germany, if you extrapolate from them to the likely outcome of the elections, the national elections that are scheduled for February 23rd, the result will be a catastrophic defeat for the two primary architects of the war. That is Olaf Scholz and Annalena Baerbock. So the parties, the Social Democratic Party and the Green Party. I think they will be the net losers. Now, will the likely winners of the next German elections, the Christian Democrats, be any better? Here, it's hard to say, because on the one hand, they are ideologically committed to a strong alliance with the West and to follow America's lead, as they have historically done as a party. On the other hand, with the results of that policy staring them in the face, the defeat of the Social Democrats and the Greens, I have to think that there will be some realization among dissident groups or minority factions among the Christian Democrats that there is a better policy to be had. And the big elephant in the room is, of course, how successful, how many more votes will the Alternative for Germany get? And will they finally be allowed to play the role in German politics that the millions of voters expect them to have in Germany?
One question, though, and that is, okay, I agree with you that I'll put it like this. In my opinion, Germany has been an occupied territory, and it's been dragged around, and its sovereignty has been usurped by the U.S. for many years. Okay. and they follow around. That being said, they have gone ahead with the U.S. in this thing that has been extremely detrimental to the economy of Germany. But doesn't that kind of also imply, if I'm following the U.S. and I'm dragging behind its coattails, when the U.S. makes a U-turn and I'm hanging to its coattails, even though it's now Trump, and Trump says, I'm tired of this, I'm going over to something else, I'm done. Doesn't that also imply the potential possibility or even likelihood that those same forces will make that U-turn also? That they're like, we're hanging on to Ukraine, and the U.S. leader says, we're out of Ukraine, and they're like we said, we're out of Ukraine, we're behind him.
No. So there's a lot of intellectual and ideological argument in German politics. There's a lot more global discussion and what does it mean for European security. They take those issues very seriously. What it does, however, what a U-turn in U.S. foreign policy does, is it offers individual politicians in Germany a way out, not to disavow what they said, not to portray themselves as lackeys of the United States, but to say, well, we are now turning inward. And in fact, German politicians like former Minister of Defense but current EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and many others, including the person who caused the collapse of the current German government, the head of the Liberal Democrats, who resigned, among other things, because he objected to the continued expenditure of German resources in favor of Ukraine when there's a looming budget deficit that has to be covered according to German law in Germany. All of this allows them to say, well, we need to shift our priorities. And if you think back to how Viktor Orban and Robert Fico, the heads of Hungary and Slovakia, began their path to advocating for peace instead of for war, it began precisely by arguing that they need to prioritize domestic issues over international ones. And as soon as that becomes an accepted part of the discourse, you take the next step and then say, well, let's argue for peace rather than for war, and all benefit from a more peaceful future in Europe.
And since right around close to the time that the Trump people will be coming in, when is it, February 23rd?
February 23rd.
Right, okay.
But so the campaign will already be in full swing.
Yes, so that creates the environment for a new government to come in and to reevaluate things and say, okay, the U.S. is going in a different direction. They're trying to get a deal with Ukraine, or they've got a deal over there. We got to start over again and start thinking of the home team. And it creates an environment for a new government to come in.
Exactly. And the signals that Trump sends in late January and February, including the nominations for new ambassadors, because we need new U.S. ambassadors in places like Hungary, Germany. They have, I think, discredited themselves by their close alliance to the Biden administration in many cases. And Trump is just going to replace them with his loyalists. Right. And that's going to be a very interesting move, and it's going to be seen as a portent of the future and the type of relations that Germany needs with the Trump administration, which is not something that's really been seriously addressed yet in Germany, but that will be very decisive in formulating what Germany's policy toward Ukraine will be.
Dr. Nicolai Petro, I certainly thank you for taking your time out, and hopefully maybe next week we can get together. There's a couple other big things, and I'm sure there'll be more between then and now for us to talk about. What the name of your latest book?
The Tragedy of Ukraine, and it's about how classical Greek tragedy, in the context of when applied to Ukraine, I should say, helps conflict resolution.
Yeah, and your Substack.
Oh, I don't have a Substack. I just
Oh,
I have a website, and I
oh,
post things to my website. It's a very simple name, npetro.net.
oh, there we go. That's an easy one. Inpetro.net. In fact, let me bring that up in because I can do that,
Sure.
and I will let all of our friends see it. All right, let's take a look, and we will show you Dr. Petro's. There we go. And this is it. And we can see here, there we go. Teach international politics at the University of Rhode Island with a focus on the role that religious, historical, and cultural narratives play in democratic development. My regional areas of expertise are Russia and Ukraine. There's his latest book, The Tragedy of Ukraine.
And I've got commentary and videos and stuff. It's all for free. I don't know how to make money on this stuff yet.
Yep. Oh, is it in Russian also?
There is a section in Russian, yeah, because I've been interviewed a lot in Russian and some in Ukrainian as well.
Do you speak Russian or Ukrainian?
Russian, I speak fluently. Ukrainian, I understand. I don't claim to speak it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And everyone, don't forget, go to inpetro.net for all the information on Dr. Nicolai Petro's good works and information. You can learn a lot. He's involved in a lot of things all over the world. Did you go to the Valdai conference?
I did not this year, but I hope to be visiting the Caucasus next week.
Oh, wow.
For a forum, for a peace forum, in fact. Yeah, in Armenia.
Oh, excellent. Outstanding. Thank you very much. All right. Well, keep up the good work and all of the work for peace. And I'll keep in touch with you. I hope to get you on again next week. Everyone, don't forget, share this on all your social media platforms. As you know, these things oftentimes in YouTube, this kinds of discussion can be, held back, throttled down, a shadow ban, things of that nature. So right now we have 391 people. So please, that means 391 times this, at minimum, this should be shared on social media platforms. Thanks a lot, Dr. Petro. And thank you all. We're out.